Welcome to the Mentor Coronavirus Q&A session, and thank you for joining us today. The contents of this webinar do not purport to provide any financial, investment or professional advice, and nothing in the content of this webinar shall be deemed to constitute the provision of financial, investment or other professional advice in any way. Our aim is to focus on some of the areas that we know have created the majority of queries we've received here at Mentor. We'll start with the job retention scheme, looking at furlough. We'll also be talking about the practical considerations around business planning and adaptation. And within that topic, we'll discuss lone working and employer responsibilities of continued operations. I'm joined today by three of Mentor's specialists, Nick Sorrid and Edwina Redhead for employment law, and Keith McIlroy for health and safety. At this moment in time, all participants are on listen-only mode, but there is an option within Zoom that you can ask questions at any time. And what we'll do is we'll attempt to answer as many of your questions as we can during this next half an hour, 45 minutes. Our answers will be general, and we'd ask you to contact us if you need anything very specific in advice regarding your own business circumstances. So, Nick, let me come to you first, if I may. We've heard a lot in the news over the last week or so about the job retention scheme, aiming to safeguard as many jobs as possible. But tell us briefly, if you can, what is furlough and when does it actually apply?
Yeah, thanks, Helen, and thanks everybody for taking the time to join this audio. I hope you find it useful. The furlough scheme was set up very hastily by the government, and its aim is to deal with those businesses that are severely affected by the coronavirus crisis. So a lot of sectors have suffered a real precipitous loss of business, and they might otherwise have laid staff off temporarily, that's to say sent them home, or made them permanently redundant. So it is effectively to ensure that those staff can remain on the books so the business can get up and running again as soon as the emergency ends. And it works by way of a grant through to businesses through the HMRC PAYE system.
Okay, thanks for that. But so there's a lot of talk about this, the government paying 80% and employers paying 20%. Do employers have to pay that 20%?
Yeah, well firstly, of course, there is a cap of 2,500 gross pay per month. But clearly this scheme is very generous and covers a wide variety of workers, and obviously will cover even higher paid workers that they will just get less of a rebate. I think it's important to look at it that the employment relationship between the employer and the employee continues during the course of the furlough, and the employer just reclaims a rebate to help them pay the wages. So once you understand that, then you can understand why reducing the wages by 20% is something that the employer would have to negotiate with the workforce. Now, that negotiation can be very, very straightforward in most small businesses. It really will be a phone call or an exchange of emails or something just to say, look, we're intending to participate in the furlough scheme. We can't afford to make up your wages beyond the 80%. Are you happy with that? And most employers will be happy, and provided the employer gets some evidence by way of exchange of emails that that's accepted, then that's fine. So an employer doesn't have to make it up, but the starting point is that the employee is due 100% of their wages unless there's an agreement to the contrary.
Okay, that seems fair. But look, what if as a business I haven't got enough cash to pay my furloughed workers until we get reimbursed from HMRC?
Yeah, and this is a real sticking point for this scheme. I think it's important that to note that the government really wants this scheme to work, and they're setting in place various grants and particularly the coronavirus business interruption loan, which I believe Rishi Sunak has made an announcement about, that the conditions for that are being eased up, particularly regarding the personal guarantees that employers were going to have to give. Not my area of expertise. What I would say, though, is from an employment perspective, it's really important to tell your staff what you're proposing to do. I think everyone's heard about this furlough scheme. So if you intend to take advantage of it, tell your staff ASAP. If you intend to reduce their pay, get that negotiated now with them, so at least they understand what their income and outgoings are likely to be, and they know that that what you're trying to do. I think being clear with your staff as well might help them avail themselves of some of the help that's available to individuals. So I think the banks are allowing fee-free overdraft facilities, for example. There's certain mortgage lenders allowing mortgage holidays and rent holidays and so on. So I think the key to this is make a decision about taking the furlough scheme. Tell your staff. Those would be my two tips on that.
And sorry, Nick, just in case you've already said this and I've missed it, we're being asked on the stream, do we have to have agreement from the employees to go on furlough?
Yes, you do, because it's a change to the normal employment relationship. The normal employment relationship is that you turn up to work and do your work. So essentially asking people to stay at home does require their agreement. They're fairly likely to agree to that. I know I would. But I think if you're also negotiating a reduction in pay because you can't afford the difference. Again, that does require an agreement. But as I say, there doesn't need to be anything really dramatic about that. It is maybe a simple phone call or exchange of emails where you're discussing the situation, telling the employee what you're proposing to do, and asking them to confirm that they're happy with that.
Okay, thanks for that. We'll come back to some more furlough questions in just a moment, but I wanted to ask the question of the panel. All of this over the last couple of weeks has been and will continue to be stressful for employees and management, causing all sorts of anxiety and different stresses along the way. What would the panel recommend to support staff to look after their mental health?
Hi Helen, I'm happy to take that question. So I think it's a very real challenge, and I've spoken to lots of business owners this week, and understandably staff are feeling extremely anxious, and that's having a real significant impact. I think there are lots of helpful resources out there. I think one that I would particularly recommend would be the NHS Every Mind Matters part of the website. For those who haven't seen it, it is very useful. What employees can do is they can go onto that part of the website, answer a series of question and answers, and that will generate their own personal mind plan. And it gives them really practical tools and tips as to what staff can do to really look after their mental health in what is undoubtedly a challenging time for everybody. I think there are some other steps that businesses can take as well. So, a lot of businesses are working in very different ways at the moment. They're enacting, continuity plans. So really being mindful around how that affects staff, being really clear with communications, and actually probably increasing your communication with your various staff members, because understandably it is a time of uncertainty and people will be feeling very worried. There are additional resources on Mind as well, so it might be worth looking at those too. And I think just, really encouraging people to, practice self-care. So making sure that they are going out for a walk or getting some exercise, that they are, eating well, they're trying to get enough sleep, they're relaxing, just, really promoting those basic things I think will help. Keith, I don't know if you've got anything to add on to that from a health and safety perspective.
Thanks very much, Edwina. I would say that that is a wonderful website. Really take the opportunity to go on it and try out that survey. But the key thing for me as well is to ensure that you regularly contact all your staff, that your management style encourages participation and delegation and feedback, and also to ensure that your managers are available to identify and respond with sensitivity to employees' emotional concerns and symptoms of mental health problems.
Thanks, Tim. Really appreciate that. Look, let's come back to some more furlough questions that we're getting coming through. Does furlough pay have to include commission, tips, bonuses, dividends at all?
No, Helen, it's very clear that it is limited to basic pay, what the government will reimburse. And I appreciate there are certain lines of business where a large proportion of pay is based on commission. So clearly where people are at home, they're not allowed to work for their employers while they're on furlough, they're not going to be earning commission. So they'll be on 80% of their basic. However, if there's any commission that's due to them from sales they made earlier in the year, then clearly the employer would still be liable to pay that. As I say, the government support isn't going to extend to that, but no, it's basic only.
Okay, that's really clear. Thanks for that, Nick. And so what happens then if at the beginning of all of this, my business chose to make some of the staff redundant because we didn't know about this job retention scheme? Am I now obligated to take them back on and put them on furlough?
Yeah, there's a lot of information out there, and a lot of it's clearly aimed at people who are struggling. So the scheme does allow an employer to take someone back on if they've made them redundant since the 1st of March, but there's no obligation on them to do so. So a business may have jumped the gun a bit and made redundancies, but on reflection may think, well, actually, if I still had those staff, I'd be able to reopen when the emergency's over. They can take those staff back on. I think there would be issues about asking the staff to repay their redundancy pay, because effectively you're sort of undoing the redundancy, so that they're not keeping the redundancy pay. You're taking them back on and putting them on furlough, and hopefully things will pick up and you'll be able to retain those employees.
Okay, thanks for that. So we're getting loads of questions now about when we've actually got staff on furlough. So if I've put some members of my team onto furlough, can I still ask them to work occasionally?
No, it's the simple answer to that question. And I think it's, you know, it's challenging because, again, I've spoken to lots of businesses this week who have asked that very question. You know, for example, can somebody come in and, you know, help to process the payroll, or help to complete a stock take, or, you know, post something on social media? And the government's advice is very clear that, you know, there should be, people who are furloughed should not be completing any work at all. So I think, unfortunately, the answer to that question is no.
Okay, that seems clear enough to me. But look, I've got enough work going on in my business, but only for a reduced number of staff. Can I split my staff into teams and and rotate them on furlough? Is that doable?
Yeah, I'll take that question. Yes, you can, but there's a minimum period of furlough of 3 weeks. So again, it takes some planning around that, but you can rotate your staff around this 3-week period, and you can re-furlough people once the 3-week period ends. So you can put them on furlough, unfurlough them, and then re-furlough them. But it's not sort of an instantly responsive system where you can ask someone to come in for a day when they're on furlough. You really have to arrange it in those blocks. Okay,
so that I mean, we've had that question a lot this morning already. Another question that we keep being asked is, whilst I've got my staff on furlough and I'm paying them, can I ask them to complete some training? What are the rules and regulations around that?
Yeah, so I'm happy to take that question. You can ask staff to complete training in that time. The only thing that businesses will need to be mindful of is that if the 80% that they are paying to staff effectively means that staff are receiving below the minimum wage, they will need to top it up for the portion of time that the individual spends training. So I think that is just something to be mindful of. The other thing to think about is that training cannot be revenue driving in any way. So clearly, you know, taking an online course, that would be absolutely fine. But if the training involved, you know, some type of work shadowing, or, you know, something that was generating revenue for the business, then that wouldn't be allowable under the scheme.
Okay, thanks for that. There are masses of questions coming through about holiday within furlough. So let's start off with the first one. Is if I furlough my staff, can I ask them to take holiday instead of furlough?
Right, Helen, I'll have a go at attacking some of these holiday questions. Of course, you can ask staff to take holiday instead of furlough. Those normal rules apply. Under the working time regs, you have to give them twice as much advance notice as the holiday that you're asking them to give, unless there's any other rules in your employee handbook. So if you want to take them take a week off, you've got to give them 2 weeks advance notice. Now, that may be something that you want to do before they go on furlough, and then you follow that up with furlough. I think that there's some really interesting questions that we actually don't know the answers to around holidays during furlough. What I would say is, if my previous logic holds true, that the employment relationship continues, then logically staff should be taking holidays during their furlough, and indeed it might be an idea for employers to designate some periods of holiday. What I would say is that we really cannot give specific advice on that at the moment, because we haven't had clarity from the government. But the logic is that they would continue to have holiday when they're furloughed. And when they take holiday, of course, that we think should be paid at their normal rate of pay rather than the 80%. But really watch this space for a definite answer on that one.
And just to be really clear here, there's a couple of things. You said again, at their normal rate of pay, but that is their basic rate of pay, not including commission, bonuses, tips.
Well, it would be how you would normally calculate their holiday pay, and we have, seems like ancient history now that we have all the case law on what holiday pay should include, but effectively, yes, what they normally would have earned. And I know that any employment lawyers listening to this will be sort of turning in their graves about what that should include. I'm not going to go there, I don't think.
Okay, thanks for that. But and just a final point on holidays is do staff accrue leave whilst they're on furlough?
I would say definitely yes. I think the point is the employment relationship continues. The whole point of this is that these staff are not going to the Department for Work and Pensions and claiming that benefits that way. They remain on the employer's books. So logically, leave would continue to accrue. I would say I believe that ACAS are putting out some slightly different guidance at the moment, but that is heavily disputed by those of us in this community. So watch this space for clarity, I think.
Okay, thanks for that. Look, we're getting questions now around, whilst we've got people on furlough, clearly they're at home, they may be perfectly well. Are they able to take voluntary work or to volunteer to do things? We've seen the NHS asking for volunteers, we've seen supermarkets asking for short-term staff. What are the rules and regulations around that?
So this is, again, a very difficult question, but if you look to say the employment relationship continues, then employers are very likely to have rules about taking on second jobs, and that continues. So, you know, if there's a furloughed employee in full-time employment and they want to get a full-time job driving a lorry for Tesco's, that's likely to be forbidden by the contract. And it's also really sort of outside the spirit of the scheme for them to be drawing two wages. I think there are grey areas. I mean, something else that isn't a grey area is lots of people do have several part-time jobs. People may work mornings for one employer and evenings for another. And of course, it doesn't prevent that continuing to happen. You're furloughed by the employer that employs you in the mornings. The employer in the evenings can continue to employ you. that's not a problem. And of course, that would apply to part-time staff if the new job they take could be fitted around the hours they're working. I think the difficult one is where people want to take sort of short-term employment for the national good, for want of a better way of putting it. Voluntary work, I think, would be perfectly okay. I think it's a good idea if the employer is aware of it. I think where it's any sort of paid work, such as fruit picking, that's a real grey area, and I think very much depends on the government's stance about whether they want to support the national good by doing this, or whether they feel that that's a cheating of the system. I think I would err on the side of caution in advising here.
Okay, that makes absolute sense. Okay, we haven't talked very much about health and safety this morning, and I want to switch to that just for a moment if I can. Keith, what are the health and safety implications of staff if they do take alternative employment during furlough? You know, from my perspective as their initial employer, I furloughed them, they've gone off to work somewhere else. What are the implications to me as their employer?
Well, your implications really sit more with the new employer. They need to, as Nick said, you need to be aware of where they're going to, but any staff carrying out any new work tasks will need to be inducted, as currently happens with your permanent members of staff and temporary. You need to make the staff aware of any current risk assessment issues. You also need to provide them with training, and all this, most importantly, needs to be recorded.
Okay, that seems to make absolute sense. We talked about furlough a lot, and furlough lasts for periods of 3 weeks, if I'm right, and correct me if I'm wrong on that front. But what happens at the end of a 3-week period of furlough if there is no work and no prospect of work?
I think
I'll take myself off mute. Do you want to go for that one, Edwina?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to answer that. So, you know, the employer can either re-furlough the individuals for a further period. Otherwise, they may need to actually start, you know, looking at some of those decisions and potentially, you know, making permanent redundancies. However, I think there is something to be said for that, because there is still a process that the employer would need to undertake, and clearly they would need to pay out any redundancy pay that is due. So it may be better for the employer to re-furlough until we are, you know, outside of this crisis. But clearly that's, you know, that's going to be, you know, a business decision, and there will be financial implications for that.
Yep.
Okay, thanks for that. So I want to move on a little bit to looking at business as a whole. We've heard this phrase non-essential business being used. If we've got what we deem to be a non-essential business, but we've still got plenty of work, are we able to continue trading?
I'll take that one, Helen. The guidance on this continually changes, so it's quite fluid. So forgive me for saying that you need to keep checking, because the government gave us some instructions 2 weeks ago, different instructions last week. But currently, it's all about your risk assessment again. And I'm sorry I keep using that phrase, but it's key. If you can demonstrate that you can carry out a work task by keeping social distancing and people safe, you have a process in place to report issues, including health issues, then currently you can carry on. But as I said, this guidance from the government may change going forward.
Okay, thanks for that. But what if I can continue trading, but my staff don't want to work? They're scared, you know, they've got people at home who are being shielded. You know, what's the situation there? What can I do?
I'll go first on this one again, Helen. Basically, people who are quite legitimately concerned, so you should have a discussion with them as an employer, find out what their specific concerns are, see if you can address them. again, there's so much information out there, and I ask you to please use the official websites. Don't go on fake news, as people like to say, but basically find out what it is that they're concerned about. If you can't address it, then it's probably best to let them work from home if you can possibly accommodate that, or be off work. It's I'm sure Edwina might be able to add some stuff around the HR side, but from a health and safety point of view, it's not a healthy thing to force people to do things they really do not want to do.
Yeah, I would absolutely echo that, Keith. I think the key thing will be for employers to really understand what those concerns are, because understandably lots of people will be feeling very anxious, and that's, you know, that's very legitimate. So I think it's really understanding what the issue, you know, in hand is, and then for the employer to speak to that staff member to see, you know, how that can potentially be addressed. Now, hopefully that, you know, will have already been considered as part of the risk assessment, and, you know, the employer will have made lots of adaptations already to ensure that they're following the Public Health England guidelines. But I think, you know, it's really, really important to not dismiss that, to really get to understand, you know, what the concerns are, because it may be that, you know, if one person is feeling that, then equally others are. And, you know, we do need to be mindful that things can also, you know, turn, you know, quite negative quite quickly for a business in terms of, you know, reputational factors. If staff feeling that they're not being, you know, sufficiently looked after and their health isn't being protected. So I think it's really important for businesses to be mindful of that. So I would certainly recommend not dismissing, you know, anything out of hand. Really, you know, speak to people and understand what the concerns are and what you can do to help address that.
Okay, thanks for that. This might sound daft, and I'm talking health and safety again here, but what are the things that we need to consider specifically for our staff safety if we are asking them to come into an office or a warehouse or a factory? And as a subsequent question to that one, Keith, what do I tell my first aiders to do?
Thanks, Helen. Again, something I've been asked a few times myself. I would initially draw you back to your COVID risk assessment, which again, we've got a template available on NatWest Mentor Live. What I'd like to focus on though is the requirement for lone working, because these people are being put at risk more than most. A definition of a lone worker, for those who aren't sure what constitutes lone working, is that there's someone who works by themselves without close or direct supervision. So for example, they could be delivery drivers, health workers, engineers, security staff, cleaners, people working in a warehouse, or even from home. So you need to think about who's involved and which hazards could cause those people working at, what could cause the biggest problems those people working alone. So you must train people, you must supervise and monitor lone working, that's key, and on a regular basis. Keep in touch with them and respond to any accident. You need to consider certain risks that may affect that lone worker. One of them might be violence in the workplace. It could be stress and mental health or well-being, which we've talked about earlier. A key one is a person's medical suitability to work alone. Do they have underlying health conditions? Someone who's got a severe heart condition, bad diabetes, bad asthma, people who can go into shock. These aren't people who should be working alone, especially in these times. But if you have someone who has got one of those conditions, set up a process where you're regularly contacting them, and the contact will be greater the more severe the condition. The workplace itself also needs to be considered. So for example, if people are working at heights or lifting heavy loads and they're by themselves, this could put them at risk. So if someone fell off a ladder and there's no one else around, who's going to be able to get first aid or any assistance they require? So you need to consider what you do there. From a first aid point of view, the main consideration is basically to make sure that your first aiders adhere to their first aid training. And just a reminder that everyone must wear the gloves provided in the first aid kit, so make sure you've got plenty of spare supplies for those. And they must not attempt to give mouth-to-mouth resuscitation without using a face shield. Again, they will be in your first aid kit.
Okay, you've mentioned face shield there. Okay, so I'm going to ask the big question. Should I be issuing additional PPE and particularly face masks to any staff that I'm bringing into a collective workplace?
Very pertinent question. I was on a call with the World Health Organization this week, and we asked what is the current guidance supplied by them, and remembering that most governments will take their guidance from the World Health Organization. They're basically saying that the current guidance is still that only healthcare workers and people who are tested positive should wear them. The latter is to prevent the spread from people who have tested positive already, so if they cough, it's contained. This may change in the future, and I imagine it might do, because I understand today Germany are looking at making it more of a thing you should be doing. But currently, our guidance from our government is those two areas I've mentioned.
Okay, thanks for that. I know quite a few people have asked for this. Where should I be looking for the latest advice on all of this?
Well, again, official website, so gov.uk, Public Health England, the National Health Service, the Health and Safety Exec, and also the Mentor Live COVID-19 Digital Hub will give you up-to-date and current with our legislation's information.
Perfect. Thanks for that. So what I want to move on to now is talking a little bit about business. So my business can continue, and I realise that I'm going to have to change what's going on in the business. But Edwina, what are the main things that I really need to be thinking about for the future?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important to take a short-term and an immediate-term approach to this. So certainly looking at, a 30 and 90-day plan. But I think some questions that, all businesses should absolutely be considering is, just revisiting what their business direction is. That may have shifted slightly over the past couple of weeks. It may continue to do so over the weeks ahead. So I think, being really clear on what your immediate goals and priorities are, also being mindful around what your competition are doing in this time, I think can be helpful. And just trying to get ahead of, are there any known challenges that you are going to face over the coming weeks? Actually just starting to map that out, I think, is a very useful exercise to do. I think another thing to think about is the demand on your business. Now, clearly, the coronavirus is affecting different businesses in different ways. Some will be facing, understandably, a downturn, whereas, for other businesses, there is a spike in demand for their need for their services or products. So I think actually getting to really understand what demands are going to be placed on you over the coming weeks, and, is that going to likely increase or decrease? Again, trying to map that out, I think, is going to be a useful exercise. And then I think finally, being really mindful around the shape of your workforce. So thinking about actually, what roles and skills do you absolutely need to operate, even, on a skeleton structure, and actually what are those minimum numbers that you need to be able to safely operate? I think that's really important. And being mindful of your own workforce. They may already, have some challenges with either childcare limitations. You may have people that are already off sick, they're suffering personally with symptoms, or they're self-isolating because someone in their household does have symptoms. If we go on the government's advice, we're expecting that to, rapidly increase in the weeks ahead. So if there is, suddenly a high level of absence in your business, are you going to continue to be able to operate? I think planning some of these questions out as much as you possibly can will just help businesses to take more control of the situation at the moment. But clearly this is something that needs to be regularly reviewed.
Okay, seems like good advice. Thanks for that. But you've mentioned a couple of things in there about childcare issues, about people with relatives or people in their household who are being shielded or vulnerable. What do I do if I've got a number of my workforce who have got childcare issues or are currently either needing to be shielded themselves or shielding members of their families or households? What do I need to do?
A couple of questions there. So I think in terms of the people that are, shielding, if there is somebody, if you have an employee who is shielding, the government have clarified that those employees who have been contacted by one of the NHS bodies, they can effectively be furloughed in this period. So I think that is just something to be mindful of. Now, people who are, understandably having challenges with childcare, obviously the schools are closed. I think there's lots of people up and down the country in that situation. Now, that is a real challenge, and that's something that employers need to try and work with their staff on as much as possible. So actually, can they flex that childcare with partners? Can the organisation be a little bit more flexible and allow working at different times of the day? I think it's about the employer and the individual trying to work together to come up with appropriate solutions. Now, of course, if the individual wants to take a period of holiday or unpaid leave, they can absolutely request that and ask their employer grant that. But I think, really it's a very understandable challenge, and it's certainly a conversation that the employee and employer would need to have together to work out a solution.
Okay, thanks, Edwina. So here's the one that none of us want to have to face in the future, but what if we do continue to trade and people come into work, and then somebody, a member of staff, chooses to make a claim against us as employers in later months when all this is over?
Well, Helen, I'll take that one. Again, you're going to hear me use that wonderful phrase, risk assessment, but it is important that everything is recorded. That's the key point here. And any additional documentation regarding the decisions you've made, so far as is reasonably practicable, keep records of regular monitoring of risk and keep training records. You need to be able to evidence this stuff if we go to claim. A question I've been asked a few times is, can clients be prosecuted? Well, the answer is yes, potentially. Greater risk of this is if you force employees with low immunity to work. So one of the points we covered earlier on is if you force people in, and that could pay out badly going forward. It is important to identify vulnerable employees through their medical records or health questionnaires to help you pull together your potential identified risks. You need to consider, would it have been practicable to do more? So could you have done more in that time? If the answer is yes, then you're leaving yourself exposed, and that's probably a good test for a breach potentially 6 months down the line. General consensus, though, is that we probably won't be getting a lot of prosecutions further down the line, but no one really knows. So I'm sorry, I can't give you a definitive answer. But the key thing is suggested that it's suggested that all employers let their insurance companies know of the measures you're taking. Again, that could be key going down the line.
And I'm just happy to add a further point to that, Keith. I think the key thing here is really just trying to avoid any claims being made in the first place. So I think, a question that all businesses can ask themselves is what I'm asking staff to do reasonable? I think that's a really, key question for people to be considering. And actually, further to that is what I'm doing. How is that viewed by wider society? I think maybe just using those as some guiding principles should help to avoid claims, being raised further down the line.
Okay, thanks for that, team. So finally, I'm going to turn to my business and its need to change. So clearly my customer base and customer demands could quite easily change as time goes on. So what have you seen and experienced other businesses have been doing, and what advice might you give in those circumstances?
I think it's a really good question. I think, over the last few weeks, we have seen businesses, pivoting their business model and actually being quite intuitive and innovative in what they're doing at the moment. So, some examples that we're aware of, which I'm sure you've probably also seen in your local community, greengrocers and vegetable suppliers, who previously may be selling wholesale to restaurants, actually pivoting and coming up with veg boxes and delivery schemes to help support the community. We've seen lots of different manufacturers getting involved with making parts for ventilators and really supporting the coronavirus efforts. property management companies and hotels, again, offering out their premises to either NHS workers or key workers. So I think, you know, lots of people are trying to help support the efforts, but also look for ways that they can continue to operate in some capacity. So I think, again, the guiding message here is to really focus on what you can be doing right now, rather than, you know, all of those limitations and what you can't be doing. I think, you know, everyone should be being prepared to adapt to, you know, changing business priorities and changing consumer needs. So I think they're just some of the, you know, the principles that I would just encourage people to follow. But really, you know, take heed of what your customers are asking for right now, and just be mindful again of what society's needs are. I think if you're following those principles, then, you know, you're not going to go too far wrong. But it is a very challenging time, and clearly businesses do need to adapt given the circumstances that we find ourselves in.
Thanks for that, Edwina. I do want to come back to the furlough scheme again, because clearly you can imagine that we've had well in excess of 300 questions coming through on the stream today. So just a couple more, and I'm really going to put you guys on the spot. If a business has had somebody who's resigned during this last period, or they have appointed new staff who maybe haven't yet started or have only just started recently, what happens regarding furlough? What's the situation with those employers?
Yeah, Helen, I'll take that one. That's very much out in the public domain. I think Martin Lewis said something on his show last night about this. And the key date is the 28th of February. Now, in normal circumstances, an employee may choose to leave and go on to a new employer. Now, if they left and they started with their new employer after the 28th of February, the new employer can't claim under the furlough scheme. That's the problem. So Martin Lewis is suggesting that they go back to the old employer and ask to be re-employed, because the old employer can make the claim. Now, that's a very public-spirited thing for the employer to do if they're happy to have that employee back. But it is very difficult for employers, as we discussed earlier. They have cash flow issues, and there is no obligation on them to take on an employee just to put them on furlough. And bear in mind that, you know, they need to look at their longer-term business needs. They may think, well, I wouldn't be looking to keep that employee on long term anyway if I re-employed them, but they'd be faced with the cost of potentially making that person redundant. So I'm not meaning to be cruel here, but the scheme does have a sort of glaring hole in it for those people who maybe have been employed for a long time, but just unfortunately moved employers within that time. We are looking to see if the Chancellor is going to address that, because there are rumblings that is seen as a big issue. Difficulty with it is, I think, that the whole point about the PAYE records issue on the 28th of Feb was to try and avoid people making false claims for made-up employees, people who they didn't have any records for. So I think that's potentially the difficulty. The thing to bear in mind is that the employers have no obligation. If an employee approaches you to say, can I have my job back? You've got no obligation to do that. Difficult though that may sometimes be.
Okay, seems fair. And one I think that is clearly based to a cash flow question. But if at the moment I'm currently paying my staff weekly, can I choose to change that to monthly to adjust and allow for my own sort of cash flow problems within my business?
Well, I'll take that one as well, Helen, because that's a really legitimate question. And you get a little bit of a feeling when you look at the coronavirus job retention scheme that it's been sort of created by people who are paid monthly without thinking, well, there's a whole world out there of people with variable earnings who are paid weekly and so on. it is a change to terms of employment. If you change employment to pay from weekly to monthly, we know it could cause real difficulties. It's very much like the universal credit scheme, where you have to wait 5 weeks for your pay. If people are used to a weekly pay packet, suddenly having to wait a month for it causes them real difficulties. So it's not necessarily a change to terms and conditions that employees would readily agree to. Appreciate you don't know till you've asked, but what I'd suggest you do, if you want to do that, because it may simplify things for you, is ask. But it's a difficult one, because the employee may not agree, and may, it may be quite upsetting. You're into the sort of taking advice on the situation front then, very definitely.
Thanks, Nick. I really appreciate that. And apologies to all of you for putting you on the spot with some of those questions today. Look, we've covered as many questions as we possibly can in our 45 minutes, and our time is now up. But at this point, I usually summarise the key points we've covered. So I just want to do that very, very briefly for you all. I feel it's relevant to reiterate and emphasise Edwina's advice. It's key to plan, adapt. Most important of all is to communicate to staff, and as Keith said, to our insurance companies as well, and not to forget Keith's really important advice around risk assessing and doing that regularly and recording that. I would encourage everybody that's on this call today to keep referring to the Mentor website, where you'll find the most frequently asked questions. Our existing clients, please log into your Mentor Live accounts and check out the Coronavirus Hub on the landing page. It's got templates, letters, resources that are all there to help. It will also have the registration links to any future sessions that we do, and as well as that, we have the recordings of past sessions that we've done that will still be kept within there whilst they're still valid. For all those who've registered for this session today, there will be a follow-up email with you shortly that will guide you to our website, frequently asked questions, and also it will enable you to register to use our Mentor Live system free of charge. So please do take a look at that when that comes through to you. If we haven't specifically answered your question today, because it is very specific to you and your circumstances, please do contact us. We are here to help. And I'd like to thank our panelists for sharing their knowledge today. And most importantly, I'd like to thank all of those who took the time to join us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.